Hello, Professor Chomsky. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Glad to be with you.
So, we're today in Tucson, Arizona, and many people, also you call it occupied Mexico often, but I've also heard that some other people call it occupied indigenous land. So, where are we, in your opinion?
Well, of course, at the time of the European invasion, there were maybe 80 million people in the Western Hemisphere. Contrary to what was believed until recently, they had rich cultures. North America had large cities, well-cultivated areas. Bolivia had some of the most sophisticated agricultural systems in the world. There was trade up and back through the hemisphere. Most of this has been discovered since the 1960s. And within some time, things really changed radically. If you walk around this campus, for example, you'll see statues which are monuments to the destruction of Native America. There's Native American courses, there's indigenous students are brought in, there's respect, some not enough, but some degree of respect for indigenous cultures. In fact, what's called the immigrant crisis in the United States, which is mostly a moral crisis in the United States, if you look at the migrants who are being treated viciously and deported back to terror and violence for which we are largely responsible, many of them are indigenous people or of indigenous ancestry, at least in large part.
Okay. So you already mentioned the so-called immigration crisis, and in fact US refugee policy is making a lot of headlines at the moment all over the world. We see parents separated from their children, and we hear all these brutal stories. But here in Tucson we are also very close to the southern border, and there is also a huge pro-refugee activism here in the city. Many people...
I would say huge, but substantial. That's an interesting aspect of southern Arizona.
Yes.
It's the politics in general are very right-wing, but in Tucson itself and some other places there are activist groups with fair amount of public support who do very courageous things. They set up camps in the desert where they try to offer, I've visited them, they're very primitive, but they can have a very simple clinic, some place for beds if people who manage to evade the border guards, and they try to pick them up in the desert. They give them some help, some medical help if they need it. They leave, they go out into the desert, which is pretty forbidding. If you want to take a look, you might try. It's
been there.
You've been there.
Yeah,
well, it's and they leave water bottles and things, and occasionally they get arrested for littering, or sometimes the border guards come and destroy everything they've left, but they keep going.
You already talked a bit, or you hinted to the criminalization of people who help, for example, people who help refugees. In Europe, for example, we have a very similar situation. We see people who rent ships or boats, and they go out into the Mediterranean to look for refugees who need help, and they literally save lives. But at the same time, you see politics and media criminalizing these people, attacking these people.
Let me say that I've been very critical of the United States, but Europe is much worse, much worse. I mean, if even Germany and Merkel, one of the most liberals, much worse than here. So, for example, take Europe's reaction to the people fleeing from Africa. As I mentioned, Europe has a certain history in Africa. Europe destroyed Africa, devastated it. Slave trade had a hideous effect on Africa. European invasions and destruction and violence were horrifying. And it's not ancient history. It goes right to the present. He's got a cell phone. Where do the minerals come from? They come from eastern Congo. How do you get them? Well, there are warring militias who've murdered maybe 5 million people in the last couple of years, with multinational corporations looking over their shoulder so they can pick up inexpensive minerals that we can use for our iPhones. That's today, you know.
Your optimism is always impressive. How can you have this attitude in today's world? And, you know, many people are pessimistic for good reason. How can you not be?
I happen to be 90 years old. I lived through and my childhood memories are the Depression and the rise of fascism. First article I wrote when I was 10 years old for elementary school newspaper was about the rise of fascism in Europe. I can date it exactly because I know what happened. That's what the world looked like then. The rise of, I can remember listening to Hitler's speeches over the radio. I didn't understand them, but there was no way of misunderstanding the reaction of the crowd. You know, it was frightening. It was also local in my own neighborhood. Happened to be the only Jewish family in a mostly Irish and German Catholic neighborhood, which was not only radically anti-Semitic, but pretty much pro-Nazi. Now, that's what the world looked like in the 1930s. And Nazism and fascism were no joke. I mean, what's happening now is ugly in many ways, but nothing like that. And what's happened since is a complicated story, ups and downs. There was the civilizing effect of activism, which I mentioned. There's neoliberal regression, but if you look at what's been achieved by popular activism, I think there's plenty of reason to be optimistic.
Okay. Thanks a lot for this interview, Mr. Chomsky.